Thank you, Matthias, for having me on today, and thank you to Maxon as well. I'm super excited to be here and show you my most recent project, as well as a breakdown of how I built one of the scenes. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Ryan Talbot, and I'm a freelance 3D artist. I've worked on a variety of projects over the years, ranging from product animations, to music videos, to projection dances for Australia's Got Talent, and a lot of passion projects in between. Today I'm here to show you my most recent passion project, titled The Search. So without further ado, here's that. Alright, so that was The Search, and I want to give a quick shout out to my friend Jonathan Richmond. He goes by John Scores on Instagram because he composed all the original music for this piece, and he's just been really great to work with. So I just wanted to give him a little shout out, as well as my friend Eden Danilo, who helped out with the sound design on that piece. Today I'm going to be going over specifically the cave scene from The Search and how I built out this crystal cave, starting with just blocking out some cubes, to laying down the textures, as well as building the materials and scattering some crystals throughout here. So let's jump into it. Alright, so today I'm going to be breaking down how I built the cave scene from my short film. And you see we have our drone in here for scale, and then we're going to start blocking out the shape of our cave around that drone. And so you can see here I'm just placing down these cubes to give myself a rough idea of what these cave walls are going to look like. So we're just blocking this out really roughly, and then we're going to actually put these cubes into a volume mesher, and that's going to allow us to connect all of these into one great big object that we can then start sculpting on to create some interesting shapes. So you can see this is super basic. I'm literally just taking cubes and dragging them into different spots, and it doesn't matter if you have overlapping geometry here. We're just blocking out our general scene. That's all we're doing. So I might duplicate this, scale it down, move it up a little bit, and move it out and down a little bit so we get something like that. And then when I'm done with one side, I can select all these and hit Alt-G to group them in a null. And then we can duplicate that null and drag that out to the other side and flip it around. So we're just getting the rough shape of our cave in here. And I might move this back right here because we don't want both sides to look exactly the same. We want to add some variation. So I might move this back a little bit as well, and maybe move it down a bit and move this over here. And maybe we'll go with something like that. Maybe I'll move that over here. So I think this is sticking out a little bit too much, so I might move these cubes back a little bit so that they're a little bit more further into the wall until we get something that's kind of interesting like this. And let's say we're happy with this as our cave. You know what? I actually might just take this right here and extend it out a little bit more before we move on. And we'll say that this is our cave right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit Shift-C and we're going to type in volume builder. And what we're going to do is we're just going to take these two nulls and we're going to put them inside our volume builder like so. And now it's going to turn our cave into a bunch of voxels. So if I select this volume builder and I turn up the voxel size to something like 35, that's going to give us a lower resolution mesh once we place our volume mesher in here. So I'm just going to type volume mesher, and then we're going to drop this volume builder into the volume mesher. And now you can see all of our cubes have started melting into each other, into one object, and we sort of have the start of our cave here. So I'm just going to hit C on this to make that editable and rename this to cliffs. And now I'm just going to hit Shift C one more time and search for our pull brush, and I'm going to start smoothing this out. So one shortcut you can use on any sculpting tool is holding down Shift, and that's going to turn your brush into a smoothing brush automatically. So this is normally a pull brush, you can see, but by holding Shift, it turns into a smooth brush. And a couple more shortcuts you can use is Control middle mouse and drag up, and that will increase the pressure of your brush. And you can hold Control middle mouse and drag outwards or inwards, and that will change the size of your brush. So I'm going to hold down Shift and start smoothing out some of these corners, because we don't want this to look geometric. You know, we want this whole thing to look organic, and we want to break up the uniformity and break up all of these parallel lines. We don't want any perpendicular lines at all. So we're just going to start smoothing this out until we get something that's starting to look more organic. We might pull this back out. That might be a little bit strong, so I'll decrease the strength here. I'm going to pull that out and then smooth it, and then I definitely want to start bringing out this bottom edge right here, so that we don't have such a uniform shape dipping into the river. And then I'll smooth this out as well. And I find this step to be somewhat therapeutic. You know, you're just sort of, it's like painting, but in 3D. So I'm just gonna hold down Shift, smooth that out, and that's looking pretty good. So I might take my camera and I might place it somewhere along here so that we can sort of look down into our river. So I'm actually gonna place, not a light, I'm gonna place a camera down right there, and that's going to be our camera position. So I believe I have camera turned off in our filter, so now we can see that angle a little bit better. So I'm gonna work on the other side of our cliff, holding down Shift once again to smooth this out. And I might increase my brush size just so I can cover a bigger area at once. And we're just going to keep smoothing all this out. And really, for this demonstration, all we need to do is smooth out the area that we're going to see in the camera. So I'm just going to smooth this out down here, smooth this area, check our camera, see what we're seeing there. And then I'm going to pull this out into the river a little bit. I'm going to start pulling this and then smoothing it, pull, smooth, rinse and repeat. Just breaking up that uniformity in any way we can. And that's looking pretty good. So I might actually hit UF to select this side of the cliff, and I might pull this back over here just to make our river a little bit wider, you know, just so that we have a little bit more to work with here. And that's looking pretty good to me. So the next step is to start sculpting our riverbed. So this plane right here will be our water. So I'll just rename that water, and we'll just change the color. So we're going to switch this to use color on, and we'll make it a light blue, and I'll turn on X-ray so that we can see through it. And then we're going to duplicate this plane and rename this one riverbed. And I want to make this riverbed editable. And in this next section, I want to show the sculpting tag and how you can use this to sort of sculpt non-destructively on our riverbed. So I'm going to jump into the sculpting layout, and with my riverbed selected, I'm going to hit this subdivide button, and you'll see that has generated a sculpt tag on our riverbed. And this is great because from here on out, anything we do on our riverbed will happen within the sculpting tag, as long as we're using the sculpting tools. So for example, I have my riverbed selected, and if I start pulling this up and I delete this sculpting tag, voila, we still have our original geometry. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to make sure that I have my lines on so I can see how many segments we're working with, and I'm going to hit subdivide a few more times That way we have a good amount of detail to work with here. So I'll switch back to our quick shading, and I'm actually going to turn off use color, or maybe we'll keep it on and we'll make it more of a brownish color so that we can see it a little bit better. And then I'm going to move our riverbed down below the water, and we're going to turn off X-ray. So now I'm just going to select my riverbed, select my pole tool, and I'm going to start sculpting on this. And now we're going to get this nice intersection happening where we can create a new rock layer that intersects our cliff and our riverbed. And this is just going to help break up that uniformity once again. That's a common theme throughout this demo, is breaking up the uniformity. That's what I love about doing nature scenes, is that it doesn't look good if it's perfect. It's all about messing up your geometry and making it look not bad, but not uniform. And I find that easier to do than making things look perfect. So I'm going to shut off my water for a second just so we can see what's happening here. So we have this nice dip happening, and I'm just going to smooth out our riverbed a little bit. That way we have a somewhat smoother transition to our water. And if I turn that water back on, what we can start doing too, if I make that brush a little bit smaller, I can start pulling up rocks through the riverbed. That way we get these nice river rocks that appear in our final render. And once again, this is breaking up the uniformity of our river and just adding some nice detail in there. Some nice smooth eroded rocks. And there you go. So if we jump back into our camera, I might actually drop a protection tag on this real quick. And that's just gonna prevent us from accidentally moving the camera around. So see, I'm holding down Alt and left clicking, but it's not letting me orbit while I'm in the camera. So that's that. That's looking pretty good. Let's hop back over into our default layout, and let's start dropping some materials on here. So I have this cliff material, which I've already set up, and I'm gonna work under the basis that we all know how to plug in some texture maps to a Redshift material. This is a real displacement texture, and it's essentially just a really high quality scan of some rocks that is also tileable. So we can see what that's looking like if I locate this image. So this is what the color map looks like. There you go. And so we have a really nice displacement map that goes along with this also. And I'm just going to drop this onto my cliffs. And I'm going to switch the projection mode to cubic and change this to 250% in scale. And now you see we have some rocks going on. I have a second material which I've gathered here for our riverbed, and once again this is just a default setup. I didn't really change anything about this material except for the roughness to make it look shiny and wet since it's near the water. And I got this one from the Pixel Labs Redshift Material Pack 3. So let's just drag this onto our riverbed rocks, and let's turn off use color so we can see that texture. And we're going to change it to cubic once again, and that's looking pretty good to me. So there you go. We have our basic geometry set up, and at this point, if you're working on your composition, it's a good idea to work on your composition at this stage because you have your scene blocked out. So I'm just going to jump back into my camera, and we'll turn on the Redshift IPR, and I'll just dock that right there. And let's see what this is looking like. Another thing I like to do is I like to hit Shift V and go into my view settings right here and turn up the border opacity to 100%. That way I'm only seeing what I'm getting in the final render. Alright, so let's see. And of course it looks like trash right now because we don't have any lights in our scene and no displacement going on. So why don't we start by dropping a light in our scene. So I'm going to lock this camera in place on our IPR, and that way I can jump out of it in our viewport without changing it here in our IPR. And I'm going to drop in a area light. So let's scale up this area light, and you can see now our scene is suddenly dark because it does no longer has the default lighting. And we'll move this area light all the way to the back of our scene, and we're just going to move this up a bit so it looks something like that. And we're going to reduce the overall brightness of our light. Right now it's set to 100. We're going to try something like 6. We're going to change the color of our light to be a light blue. Hit OK. And we're also going to change the spread to be something like 0.25. The lower your spread, the more directional your light becomes. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. The next step would be to add some displacement onto our materials. So let's right click on our cliffs and let's drop a Redshift object tag on here. And under geometry, I'm going to turn this on to override, enable tessellation, and turn on displacement. And it's going to take a second to update. I'm also going to need to turn up our maximum displacement to something like 50 and 50. So you might have to toy around with that number a little bit to get what you're looking for, but I just know from doing this demonstration a few times that 50 is probably going to give me what I want. Alright, so now you can see we have some displacement going on our rocks. It's already looking a lot better. Why don't we set up our river material, because that's the glaring issue right now, is that our river is just a flat piece of blue. I don't even know. So let's drop a Redshift material in here, and let's just rename this river, and let's open up this guy, and I'm actually going to dock my IPR next to my shader graph so that we can see this a little bit better. And so in our material, what we're going to want to do to create a water shader is change our refraction and transmission to 1, and that's going to make our water look like glass. And so real quickly, I'm going to actually turn off our tessellation and displacement in the global overrides. That way this updates a little bit quicker. And of course we need to drop our river material onto the water. So let's do that. And now you can see it's definitely clear now. And the next thing we're going to want to do is add some subsurface scattering into this. So I'm going to change the scatter scale to be 0.01, and we'll see what that's looking like. So if I actually turn on my render region and turn on bucket rendering, it's going to render a lot faster and a lot cleaner. And you can see now we're getting this sort of this foggy water, which is looking a lot better. It looks like it has some depth to it. So I'm actually going to I'm going to keep those settings as is. I'm going to turn up my absorption scale to 0.02%, which is just going to help bring out the color when I change the transmittance color. And so we're going to change this transmittance color to be something like a light blue, and we're just going to see what that looks like. That looks a little bit too saturated in my opinion, so I'm just going to dial this back a little bit. And then I'm going to change the scatter coefficient color to be a blue as well, and let's see what that is looking like. And I think that's looking pretty good. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add in a bump map to this. So let's search for some Redshift noise, and let's bring our noise texture in here, and we're going to plug this into a bump map node. And before we do that, we're actually going to check our noise to see what it's looking like. And we can do that by just plugging it directly into our surface. And I'm going to turn off bucket rendering, so you can see this is what our noise pattern looks like. And by plugging this into our bump, it's going to give us some nice ripples and highlights if we have a light shining on it. So I'm going to change this noise type to turbulence, and I think turbulence works pretty well at the default settings. So I'm just going to plug this into my texture, and then we're going to take our bump map and we're going to plug this into our overall bump input. And we're going to plug this material back into the surface. And I'll turn on bucket rendering once again, and it's a subtle change, but you can sort of see it happening right here, where we're getting some a little bit of detail being picked up in the specular highlights. All right, so the next thing I want to do, if I actually undock this, since we're pretty much done setting up our river shader, I'm going to dock this back with our viewport here. And we're going to add a little bit of displacement on our water. So I'm going to turn up the segments to something like 800 and 800. That way we have some geometry to work with here. And then we're going to drop a displacer into our scene and make that a child of the water. And so this is a pretty simple and standard way to do some basic animation on your water. You essentially just drop a noise in here. And let me actually just jump into our camera so we can see that noise happening. And I'm actually going to turn off our X-ray mode so we can see this a little bit better. But that's what that's looking like right now. So what we need to do is turn up the scale of our noise, and that's going to give us something like that. And then what I did was I just changed the height to 5 centimeters to make that effect a little bit more subtle. And then if you wanted to animate this, all you would have to do is change the animation speed to 1, and then add some movement on the Z-axis, and change the speed percent to 1%. And so if we pause our IPR and play this back, you can see now we're getting some animation, we're getting some evolution of the noise, as well as the whole thing sort of moving downstream. So that's just a nice little subtle effect when you get to the animation stage. So I'm going to turn the displacement back on in our scene, that way we can see what that's looking like once again. And I want to add some more variation into this rock material. So for example, near the river, I want to add a mossy variation of this rock. So what we can do is we can actually paint a vertex map on our cliffs, and then we can use that to blend a new variation of the material into our cliff. So let's just select our cliff, and all you have to do to paint a vertex map is go up to Character, select your paint tool, and then you just simply start painting. So I'm just going to paint this on here, and similarly to our sculpting tools, holding Shift will smooth out our vertex paint. And one thing to keep in mind is that the vertex map is dependent on the resolution of your geometry, so you do need a fair amount of detail in order to create a detailed vertex map. And you can see I'm not creating a uniform line across here. We're all about breaking up that uniformity and breaking up those patterns, so I'm just sort of being a little bit random with where I'm putting it, but still keeping it near the bottom where the river would naturally be more mossy. So let's paint the same thing along our other side, and we're just going to go to town here, painting vertex maps. So holding down Shift once again to smooth this out, and you can also hold Control, and that's going to erase your vertex if you so desire to do that. And holding down Shift, and now we should get something that looks like that. So if we select our vertex map, we can see where that's going to show up, and it's created our vertex map over here, and we're going to rename this Mossy Vertex. And so let's hop back into our cliff material, and let's start building out our variation. So I'm going to drag this down, I'm going to select all of our nodes up here and hold Control to duplicate that. It might take a moment to reload to make a copy of those nodes. So I'm just going to move this down, and I'm going to rename this RD Mossy Rock and hit OK. And really the only difference that I'm going to change about this material here is I'm going to add a color correction node, and then I'm going to change the hue slightly just to make this more greenish. So let's plug this in, and let's change the hue to 30 degrees, and we're going to change the saturation scale to 1.5. I just know this from doing this demonstration before. And then I'm also going to make our index of refraction 1.3, and that's the refractive index of water. And we just want our rocks to look a little bit shinier and a little bit more wet down near the river. So we need to blend these two together now, and I'm going to drop in a material blender node. And we're going to plug our first material into our base color and our mossy rock material into layer color 1, and then we're going to type in vertex map, and we're going to drop that in here, and we're going to use this box to select our mossy vertex. So we have that selected, and we're going to connect this into layer 1 blend color 1, and voila, now we have our materials blended. So all I have to do now is plug this material blender into our output surface, and you can see our preview's already updating here. And if I reload our Redshift IPR and I turn off that render region, it's going to take a moment because we have displacement turned on once again. But once it's done, we should be able to see that mossy variation happening. Alright, and there you go. So now you can see we're getting some green rocks down here, and then it's smoothly transitioning back up into the unaffected material. So I'm noticing that these shadows are much too dark, which is making the scene look a bit unrealistic. So what I'm going to do to combat this is I'm going to drop in a Redshift dome light, and I'm going to come down to the tint, and I'm just going to make this a value of like 29%, and let's just make this a dark blue and hit OK. And you'll notice now, instead of it dropping off into pitch black, it's just filling in these shadows a little bit with a blue tint, which looks a lot more photorealistic and accurate to the real world. So that's looking better. Now that we have that going, why don't I hop into a new file and show you a little bit about how I modeled the crystals. So I'm just going to open up a new project file, and we're going to go, actually I have a preset for this. So we're going to start with our start crystal here file. We're going to hit OK, and we're going to start modeling this with a cylinder. So what I would do is I would just take this cylinder and I would drop the rotation segments to something like 6, and then of course I would create extra variations where maybe one would be 5 rotation segments and one would be 7, and you would just create extra variations that way. But for this demo I'll just work on 1, and I'll make this editable. We're going to make all these sides optimized by hitting this optimize button, and now all the polygons should be connected. So if I go into my edge mode and hit UL, that's going to allow me to do a loop selection here at the bottom, and I should be able to scale this in, and then we're going to take this top point up here and we're going to move this up like so. And another thing I'm going to do, which you can't really notice because the Phong angle is pretty low already, but I'm just going to make this Phong angle 0. And you can see if we turn this all the way up to 180, it starts to look like a cheesy 90s video game. And making that 0 just means that we're not going to smooth out any of those hard edges. So that's looking good. Another thing I might do is I might hit MS, and that's going to bring up my bevel tool, and I'm just going to bevel this point to create some interesting shapes. And of course you can bevel any of these points, so I might take this corner and this corner and this corner, hit MS and bevel those out a little bit, and you can see now we're starting to get some pretty interesting shapes going on. And so you can see how I would go about adding variation by duplicating it, scaling it down, changing some points around and things like that. Another thing I'll do is I'll actually just grab my axis tool real quick and make sure I have move selected, and what I can do is come down here and I can actually select this point and then deselect my axis tool, and now our axis is perfectly flush with the bottom of our model. So then I'll hit PSR reset, that's going to move that to the ground plane, and voila. So let's move on to lighting and texturing this guy. So I'm going to hit play on our IPR, and that's going to give us our crystal. So let's just drop a material in here to start working with, and we're going to rename this crystal. And the process is going to be very similar to building our river shader. It's actually almost identical. So let's dock our IPR along with our material node once again, and let's make sure that our material is actually applied first before we start working on it. That's always important. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change our refraction and transmission to 1, and then I'm going to add some subsurface scattering. So let's make our scatter scale 0.05 and see what that gets us. And so now you can see we're getting this kind of milky look, which I really like. And you can see the higher we make this number, the more solid the object becomes, and you can see it starts to thin out around the edges, which I think is a really cool effect. So I'm going to keep this at 0.05, and I'm going to change the transmittance color to be blue. And let's see what that looks like. And there you go. That's the basis of our crystal material. So the next step that I would take on this is to add some imperfections. And so I actually have a folder called imperfection maps. So if we actually jump in here, we have a lot of grunge textures that we can choose from. So here's just one that I picked out as an example. I'm just going to drag and drop this into our material node. And I'm going to plug it into our roughness, if I can drag this over here. So let's go into reflection, roughness, and you can see that's immediately giving us an interesting pattern. And I'm also going to change the projection real quick from UVW mapping to cubic, and that's going to make our texture map a little bit more accurately. So I might also come in here and change the scale. Let's try 250 because that number seems to be working well for us in most situations. And now we can see this a little bit better. Now the other thing I want to do is I want to take the same exact map and I want to plug it into the bump slot. So I'm going to take a bump node and I'm going to plug that into the input and plug this into our overall bump input. And now you can see it looks as if the crystal is sort of scratched along the top, and it has that imperfection going for it. So that's essentially how I built this material. Another thing I would do is I would duplicate this material a few times to create a few different variations of it. And if I wanted to add emission to it, I would just come into the overall emission, make that 1, and then change our color and hit OK. And now you have a glowing crystal. Alright, so now that we have that out of the way, I'm going to hop over to a file where I actually finished preparing a bunch of crystals. That way you don't have to sit here and watch me do that for an hour. So let's open up that file, and you can see I just hand placed these to create some interesting variations and groupings. So I'm just going to grab this group of blue crystals here that I've prepared, and we're going to bring that back over into our cave scene. So I'm going to paste that in here like so, and then we're going to drop this whole thing into a matrix object. And the benefit of using a matrix object is that it actually bypasses your viewport, and it only shows particles in your viewport, very similar to Octane scatter. So if you've ever used the Octane scatter feature, this is pretty much the same exact thing. So I'm just dropping these cylinders in as a child to make my scene more organized, but that won't actually make a difference in what the matrix object is doing. So we're going to select our cliffs as the object that we want to clone onto, and we're going to turn up our count to something like 40,000. And now you can see we have these particles represented by our cubes cloned evenly along our cliffs. The next thing we want to do is we want to restrict this selection so we can create some areas of interest. And once again, here comes that keyword, break up the uniformity. So let's go and select our cliffs. We're going to head into polygon mode, and we're just going to start selecting some faces like so. And I want a lot of these crystals to appear down near the river, because that's just a rule that I created, that the blue crystals grow closer to the water. And it's good to come up with rules like that for yourself when you're working on these things. That way there is a method to your madness. There is a reason behind everything happening, but that doesn't mean that it has to look uniform necessarily either. But there is an order to things. So we've selected this area. I'm going to jump back into my camera, and maybe I'll select this area up here as well, and this area over here. And when I'm happy with this selection, you know what, I might just select that right there too. I'm going to go up to select, set selection, and we're going to rename this to blue crystals. And there you go. So we're going to hop back into our matrix object, and we're just going to drag this polygon selection into our selection box. And now you can see, voila, we have our blue crystals restricted to those areas. Now what we can do to further make this easier to read is we can actually change the color of our cubes to blue, and that way we know that there are blue crystals. So I'm just going to save this real quick, rename this blue crystals, and I'm going to duplicate this setup. So now we have our red crystals, and I'm going to hop back into my project file, grab our red crystals, which you can see we have a few different material variations set up, and we're going to copy those back into our scene, delete those blue ones underneath, and we're going to drop those in there. So now what we need to do is we need to set another polygon selection tag. So let's do that. I'm going to make these red first of all, and we're going to tell it to look at our cliffs, but we need to create a new selection tag first. So let's do that, and maybe I'll have our red show up here, and a little bit here, and right there. And so we'll hit select, we'll hit set selection, and that's just going to create another tag for us. We'll name this red crystals. We'll hop over to our matrix. We'll tell it to look at this selection tag instead, and voila, now we have our red crystals. So this is all great, but if we turned on the Redshift IPR right now, it would not recognize these as crystals. I don't even know if they would show up as cubes. So these are particles right now, and the way we get Redshift to recognize them as our crystals is we use a Redshift object tag on here. And what we can do is we can head into this particle tab, and we can change this to custom objects. And now, if I lock that window in place, I'm going to select these red crystals, and I'm just going to drag them into my custom objects window. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same exact thing for my blue crystals. So we're going to right click, we're going to drop a Redshift object tag on here, change this to custom objects, lock this window in place, and select our crystals and drop them in there. Voila. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add a random effector to this. So we're just going to type in random, and we don't want to necessarily move these randomly. So we're going to uncheck position. All we want to do is we want to scale and rotate them. So we want them to rotate 360 degrees on the heading randomly, and 24 degrees on the pitch, and 24 degrees on the banking. And I just know from doing this before that I'm also going to have to change the pitch to -90 degrees on both these guys to make this orient correctly. So I got that out of the way. And then I'm also going to randomly change the scale uniformly and absolutely. And what absolute scale does is it prevents your particles from scaling up and down at the same time. So with this on, I can set our scale to -0.7, and it's going to randomly shrink our particles on a scale from 0 to -0.7. So why don't we load up our Redshift IPR, and let's just see what this is looking like right now. And once again, it's going to take a minute because we have even more things going on in our scene on top of displacement. So you'll see here, we have our crystals that are being cloned, but they're being eaten up by that displacement. So what we'll do is we'll just hit Shift C, and we'll type in plane effector, select both of our crystals, and we want to make sure that our plane effector is in this effectors tab. So by default, it's going to move them up 100 centimeters on the Y. We don't need it to be that much, so I'm just going to set it to 50, and we'll just give that a chance to reload. And voila, now you can see we have many crystals being cloned. Almost too many crystals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select our blue crystals tag, and I'm going to double click on that, and I'm just going to hold down Control to delete some of these segments right here. And once again, breaking up that uniformity. And really, I just think that there's too many being cloned along this edge right here, and maybe along here too. So I'm just going to reduce the number by reducing the polygon selection. And so I still have this tag selected. I have my new selection. I'm going to go up to select, and I'm going to hit set selection once again. And that's going to take a second to update. But now you can see we are now getting some randomness, and we're getting less crystals being cloned, and it looks less uniform, which of course is a good thing and what we want to go for. Alright, so I'm just going to turn on bucket rendering real quick so that we have a better idea of what this is actually looking like, because the water doesn't really render too fast if we don't have bucket rendering on. And we can see that that's looking pretty good. I might actually jump into our river material and change the hue of that. So I'm actually going to turn on our render region one more time, and we still have bucket rendering selected. And I'm just going to jump into our material, and I'm going to change the hue to be sort of a lighter blue. Let's head more towards the green and see what that looks like. That might be a little bit too green. And that's looking better to me, like that. Yep, much better. Alright, so the last step that I'm going to show in this demonstration is how I just drop in some Quixel assets to once again break up the uniformity of this cliff right here, which is already looking pretty good. So this is just going to take it one step further. So let's go ahead and let's jump over into another project file that I have prepared, and that is called Quixel Scan Prepped. So in this one, we have this Quixel scan, which I believe is free to download. So all you have to do is go make an account on Quixel.com and download this Megascan for free. And so I'm just going to copy this out of the scene, and I'm going to bring this into our run through. I'm going to turn off that IPR so we can place this a little bit faster. And I'm just going to drop this in here like so. And you know, the goal once again is to break up that uniformity. So I'm just going to move this along into the wall like so. I'm going to look through my camera so I can see where this is actually showing up, because we don't want to waste time placing things that aren't going to even be seen by the camera. So let's just control drag to duplicate that, move this over to our other side, rotate this around, and that looks pretty good, honestly. Let's see what that's looking like. Might move that into the wall a little bit more, maybe a little bit down and out. And we also need to keep in mind that we have displacement going on these rocks. I'll scale this one on -1 on the X just so it looks a little bit different. And we'll scale it down a little bit. Maybe even bring it out a little bit and rotate it like so. And yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. So let's load up the IPR one more time and see what this guy is looking like. And of course, this stuff does take a while to render, so you just kind of have to be patient, let things render for a while, and then come back and check in on it. But let's see what this is looking like. And you can already see that this is looking a heck of a lot better already. So we're getting some nice rocks showing up in there. We're getting our crystals over here, and just so that we can see what this might actually look like when it's done, I'll just pull up one of my renders from the short film. Alright, so when all is said and done, you should end up with something that looks somewhat like this. That brings me to the end of this demonstration. I hope there was something useful in here. I hope you at least enjoyed watching this cave scene come together, or maybe you were just inspired to go make your own nature scene, which is also cool. My name's Ryan Talbot, and peace out.